Welcome, fellow book lovers. What a night. This is such a wonderful event. We're delighted that you're here. And thank you very much for that warm welcome. I'm assuming someone told you my mother's in the audience, so be very, very kind to your MC. My name is Rachel Myers. I'm a trustee for Bellingham Public Library, and it's my, yay, exactly, thank you very much. See, you're learning. Good warm reception. So it's my honor to serve as Master of Ceremonies for tonight's event. I mean, how cool is it that we get this many people in here on a Friday night to talk about books? Pretty nice. One of the many things that we celebrate as part of Whatcom Reads are the phenomenal library services and this community's love of reading. So it's really fun to culminate it in this event. In this year's brilliant, intricate Whatcom Reads novel, A Tale for the Time Being, Ruth Ozeki challenges us to think about many things. One of those things is time and the mysteries and layers of time. In this book, we're asked to consider history and memory and everything that has happened, as well as focusing on this time, this very moment right now, which has suddenly gone by already. Knowing that you have so many choices about how to spend your time, we are so thrilled that you're with us tonight. And as Now says in the very beginning of the book, you're my kind of time being. And tonight, together, we'll make magic. So it takes a good amount of time and a little bit of magic to pull together Whatcom Reads each year. So let's take a moment to thank everybody who's made this possible. This event, Whatcom Reads, was created to encourage all area residents to read and discuss the same book. We created a county-wide book club, so to speak, and present a great lineup of free programs and activities in celebration of that book. I'm curious, how many people here tonight are a member of a book club? Or two? Yeah, me too. Two of them, actually. I think this kind of program is well suited for our community. Whatcom Reads is brought to you tonight by the Bellingham Public Library, the Whatcom County Library System, Bellingham Technical College Library, Whatcom Community College Library, Northwest Indian College Library, Western Washington University Library, and Village Books. Let's give them a hand. We're also very grateful to three organizations that year after year provide significant funding for Whatcom Reads. Those three organizations are the Friends of the Bellingham Public Library, the Whatcom County Library Foundation, and aren't we lucky to have two such great organizations supporting public library services here in Whatcom County. The third supporter is Village Books. If you bought A Tale for the Time Being from Village Books, or if you buy one tonight, after tonight's presentation, a percentage of the proceeds will go towards supporting next year's program, thanks to Village Books. So let's thank those supporters as well. This is the gratitude section of the night. So we also want to give special thanks to the City of Bellingham and the Mount Baker Theater. It is through their partnership that we're able to host tonight's presentation in this beautiful venue, free of charge for all of us. We also want to, yeah, sure. We also want to thank BTTV10, the city's television station, for filming tonight's event. It will be shown on BTTV10 and posted on the city's YouTube page. A special thanks also to Allied Arts of Whatcom County for hosting the Whatcom Reads Art Challenge, on display now through the end of March at the Allied Arts Gallery. A special thanks also goes to the Pickford Film Center for hosting a sold-out screening and discussion of Ruth Ozeki's film last night. We'd like to extend our thanks also to the Fairhaven Village Inn for providing lodging for our visiting author, and to the Bellingham Herald for providing advertising support. And once again, on behalf of everyone involved with Whatcom Reads, we want to thank you all for joining us tonight. Okay, we're almost ready to introduce Ruth. I know you're not here to listen to me thank people, we just have a few housekeeping items before she comes out. After Ruth's presentation, we'll have some time to take some questions, so be thinking of your questions. You'll also have an opportunity to have Ruth sign books after the program, and we'll tell you how to do that at the end. I'd also like to ask that you fill out an evaluation form. The evaluations really help the organization secure funding for future Whatcom Reads events. And now I'd like to introduce and welcome a special guest, Bellingham City Council President Pinky Fargas, who will introduce Ruth Ozeki.
Good evening. I am very pleased to welcome you to our beautiful Mount Baker Theater and to celebrate A Tale for the Time Being, the brilliant, unforgettable novel by Ruth Ozeki. For those of you who may not have read it or not even finished it yet, let me give you a little flavor. It tells two exquisitely crafted stories. One about a Japanese teenager named Nao, who was raised in the US but is living unhappily in Tokyo. And the other about Ruth, a writer who finds Nao's diary tucked inside a Hello Kitty lunchbox that washes up on the shores of her island home on the Canadian West Coast. While that sounds simple enough, this book is simple but deeply complex all at the same time. Ruth surmises that the lunchbox and its contents made their way to the Canadian coast after Japan, the devastating earthquake and tsunami of 2011. Ruth becomes obsessed with the finding out what happened to Nao. The book flips back and forth between Nao's story and Ruth. We meet a 100-year-old Buddhist nun and a kamikaze pilot. We get to know Nao and feel her struggle with loneliness and extreme bullying by her classmates, and pondering suicide as she considers this possibly her best option for escape. Along with Ruth, we worry for Nao and puzzle over her diary and the other contents of the lunchbox. We learn about ocean currents, quantum physics, and the ways that time and place are connected. As the story unfolds, time folds in on itself, as the actions of Ruth reading Nao's diary seem to have an effect on Nao's life. Wrap your head around that. A Tale for the Time Being was a 2013 finalist for the Man Booker Prize, one of the many, many awards and accolades this carefully crafted story and its exquisite writing has received. Interspersed in its humor and hope, historical detail, and pop culture, reflections on island living, and contemplations of the relationship between readers and authors. Ruth Ozeki is a novelist, a filmmaker, and a Zen Buddhist priest. Among her many, many accomplishments, she is the award-winning author of the novels My Year of Meats, All Over Creation, and our 2016 Whatcom Reads selection, A Tale for the Time Being. A Tale for the Time Being is a tour de force, and here to talk about it tonight is its author. Please join me in welcoming Ruth Ozeki.
Wow, hi everybody. How are you? Did you get wet on the way over? Was it still raining? Yeah. It's Bellingham. I can say that I'm from just up north where we actually get even more rain. So I know what this is all about. I just want to say it is so wonderful to be in Bellingham. I really, really love this city. And I could have just sat here and listened to where are you? Listen to you thank people forever. Did you hear that list of libraries? That was amazing. I mean, that there are so many libraries supporting an event like this in conjunction with an independent bookstore. How cool is that? So I just really want to, add to the general gratitude and thank Whatcom Reads for bringing me here. Really, any excuse to come to Bellingham is fine with me, and this is a particularly nice, nice occasion. So thank you very much. I mean, really, you guys are really lucky to live here. You have you have an incredible literary culture. You have some of the best independent bookstores in the country. You have this amazing library system, and you also seem to have hot and cold running Buddhists. So that's kind of, book lovers and Buddhists, right? It's like my two loves. So I love Bellingham. That's all I can say. My husband Oliver and I, who you all know, you used to drive down from Canada to go to all of the Bellingham bookstores, and Henderson's, Michael's, Eclipse, which is newer, I think, but it's a wonderful bookstore, and also, of course, our beloved Village Books. And I was remembering back in 1996, I bought a very important book here in Bellingham. I found it in a kind of damp cardboard box on the sidewalk. I think it was in front of Michael's. The book cost $0.25. The title of the book was Beef. And it was an old cookbook of beef recipes compiled by the Washington Cowbells, which is the ladies' auxiliary of the National Cattlemen's Association. And the cookbook had a few really wonderful recipes in it, including an unforgettable recipe for beef fudge. And it was really the most amazing timing, because I happened to be writing at that time my very first novel called My Year of Meats. And so you can imagine how happy I was to find that book, that cookbook, and also this recipe for beef fudge. It was so delicious, I ended up putting it in the novel, which actually is not entirely true. I did put the recipe in the novel, but I didn't actually make the fudge. I didn't actually eat the fudge. I don't actually know whether the fudge was delicious or not. I just made up that part. And so this brings me to the next thing I want to talk about, making things up. So I was talking to my friend Tim Burnett, who I think is around here somewhere, and we did a wonderful event earlier at the Y today. It was really great. Tim is the resident Zen priest and spiritual director of Red Cedar Zen Community over on North Forest Street, I think. And yes, yay. And I was telling Tim about this event tonight, and that I was expected to stand up here and talk about myself for a whole hour. And I told him I didn't know what to say. And Tim said, well, you're a fiction writer. Just make something up. And I thought, brilliant, he's right. I'll just make myself up. And then I realized, wait, I already have. I already have made myself up. And thanks to Village Books, I have the t-shirt to prove it. I've never actually stripped on stage before, so sorry. So this is great, right? I mean, thank you, Bellingham. Thank you, Village Books, for validating my identity as a fictional character and making me feel just a little bit more real. But there's another layer to this story, too. I know that you think you're here tonight to hear a novelist named Ruth Ozeki talk about her life and work, right? Well, I hate to break it to you, but there's no such thing as Ruth Ozeki, no such being. Ruth Ozeki is indeed a complete fabrication, an invention. I made her up. Ozeki is actually a pen name. It's actually the name of an old boyfriend. we broke up, but I really liked his name. And so when I decided to take a pen name, I chose his. It's a nice name. It's short. It's easy for non-Japanese people to remember. You know, the big O at the beginning is really fun to write, and the Z is cool, and the K-I at the end is really kind of cheerful and perky, you know, Ozeki, perky. And so, while I didn't exactly make up the name, I mean, I just stole it, the fact is that, you know, it's not my name, or it wasn't, although I suppose it is now. I decided to use a pen name in 1998 in order to protect my father's identity. I grew up with my dad's surname, Lounsbury. Ruth Diana Lounsbury. That was a name I was given at birth, and in fact, it's still my legal name now. My dad grew up in a Christian fundamentalist family in Wisconsin, and in 1998, he was dying. I had just written my first novel, My Year of Meats, which was full of, well, you know, all that stuff that you put into contemporary fiction in addition to recipes for beef fudge. Stuff like, you know, sex and drugs and rock and roll. Actually, there wasn't any rock and roll in the novel. There was some sex, and there was some drugs, and there was some bad language, and a lot of drinking. And I think my dad was worried about having his name, you know, our name, on the cover of my book. He hadn't actually read my book, but he knew his daughter, and he knew the kind of book she would probably write. He was afraid that if the family name was on the cover, his sister, my aunt, might find it. She was alive at the time then and still a fundamentalist Christian, and he was afraid that she might read the book and be hurt or offended. Personally, I think he was underestimating his sister, my aunt. She was much cooler than he gave her credit for, but he was 85 years old, and he was still her big brother, and he still felt like he needed to protect her. So I offered to change my name so that he could stop worrying and die in peace. I confess at the time that I felt a little hurt and even a little bit shamed by this whole transaction. But once those feelings subsided, I ended up feeling quite liberated. The fact is that I've never really looked much like Ruth Diana Lounsbury. And I've never felt much like a Ruth Diana Lounsbury either. But Ruth Ozeki, that's a different story. She felt a lot more like who I might be. So I edited the final draft of that novel, knowing that it would be published under the name Ozeki rather than Lounsbury. And this was really an amazing experience. All the little micro constraints of being a daughter just dropped away, and I was able to write with a freedom that I'd never really felt before. I was becoming an author, the author of myself, writing myself into being. So that's the story, and it's a true one. And here I am, the author known as Ruth Ozeki. And I have to confess that sometimes when I see my name and my picture on a poster, and there are many of them in Whatcom County right now, I experience a strange, uncanny valley response. Like, who is this person, this Ruth Ozeki? Who in the world does she think she is? But I think that we all feel this way sometimes. We all ask ourselves these questions. Who is this? Who am I? And maybe these questions are what make us human. I mean, I don't see my cat asking himself questions like these. He seems to know exactly who he is. But we humans seem to need to ask ourselves these questions in order to be fully human. And then, in answer to these questions, we tell ourselves stories. Thomas King, the Canadian First Nations writer, once wrote, "The truth about stories is that that's all we are." And I think this is true. We become the stories we tell ourselves. In that sense, we are all tales for the time being. And this brings us to the reason that we're all here tonight. We're here to talk about this novel called A Tale for the Time Being, written by the aforementioned writer and time being named Ruth Ozeki. in which there is a fictional character also named Ruth, who bears an uncanny resemblance to me. We even share a husband. And tonight, it sounded a little kinky, didn't it? And tonight, I thought that I would read a little from this novel, partly because I love to read out loud, but also partly to refresh my memory, because the writer, in other words, the time being who actually sat down and wrote the novel over a 6-year period between 2006 and 2012, that person is no longer with us. She has been replaced by the author, me, who runs around talking about the novel. And there's a big difference between these two beings. One is a writer who sits alone in a cabin in the rainforest, dressed in her pajamas, and writes. The other is an author who appears before large audiences and has to pick the cobwebs and owl droppings out of her hair in order to make herself presentable. The writer writes. The author talks about writing. These are very different. But although the writer, Ruth Ozeki, is a somewhat solitary, curmudgeonly individual, the author, Ruth Ozeki, is very friendly and sociable, and she loves talking to people. And more than anything, she loves to read aloud. Reading aloud reminds her of being a little child, snuggling up with her father and mother, and being read to. It reminds her of all the stories that made her want to become a writer in the first place. So I hope you like being read to. Do you? Do you? Okay, good. Because I thought tonight I would talk a little bit about some of the things that went into writing A Tale for the Time Being, and then read a little bit, and then finish by talking about superpower. Do you all know what superpower is? Okay. Well, if you've read the book, you'll know. But but don't worry. You know, the good news is that even if you haven't read the book, you still have a superpower. And by the time you leave tonight, you'll know what it is and what to do with it. So, I'd like to start by talking a little bit about time, and about time being, and about being a time being. You know, what is a time being exactly? And what does it mean to be one? Well, the phrase first caught my attention back in 2002 when I was reading an essay by the 13th century Zen philosopher Dogen Zenji, who wrote some very, this is amazing to be able to just throw a name like Dogen Zenji out, and I can be pretty sure that most of the people in this room know who Dogen Zenji is. That's really cool. Anyway, the 13th century Zen philosopher Dogen Zenji, who wrote some beautiful, poetic, and very perplexing essays about time. And one of these essays was called Uji in Japanese. The Japanese character U means being or existence, and the character Ji means time. And this word has been translated into English in various ways: time being time, some moments, and even the theory of time. So you can see there's a wide range of interpretation here. The edition that I was reading translated Uji as the time being. And this phrase kind of stuck in my mind. I think the reason it stuck in my mind is because it's unstable. Its meaning changes depending on how you inflect it. If you put the emphasis on the second word, the time being, it means temporarily or for now, which is the colloquial idiomatic expression that we're used to. But if you put the emphasis on the first word, the time being, it suggests a being, like a human being or an alien being, an entity made up of time, kind of like the Time Lords in Doctor Who. You know Doctor Who, right? Yeah, I'm a big Doctor Who fan. So anyway, I was reading this essay, and every time I came across the phrase, I'd kind of stumble across it, sometimes reading it one way, for the time being, and sometimes the other, for the time being. And it felt somehow as if the phrase was refusing to settle, as though it had a will or a spirit of its own, something that was wanting to come to life. And I found that intriguing. Ideas are like that. Ideas are living things. And language is a living thing too. And like a living thing, this time being took up residence in my mind. It burrowed into my brain and made itself at home, and it went to sleep there. And from time to time, it would wake up and yawn and rustle around a little, and I would wonder, what does it mean, this strange, unsettled, alive phrase? But then before I could find an answer, it would go back to sleep again. And this continued for several years, until December of 2006, to be exact, when I woke up one morning and heard a voice in my head. It was the voice of a young Japanese schoolgirl who introduced herself and said, "Hi, my name is Nao, and I'm a time being. Do you know what a time being is? Well, if you give me a moment, I will tell you." So that was kind of funny, right? I mean, she's this girl, she's making a little Dogen joke, and how many people do you know who can make Dogen jokes? She was asking for a moment of my time to explain something about time, and she was also making a little pun, because her name is Nao, N-A-O, which sounds a lot like now, N-O-W. So her words caught my attention, and I wrote them down, and I waited, and little by little, her story emerged. And I'll just read the first page of the novel so you can hear her voice the way I heard it. "Hi, my name is Nao, and I'm a time being. Do you know what a time being is? Well, if you give me a moment, I will tell you. A time being is someone who lives in time, and that means you and me and every one of us who is or was or ever will be. As for me, right now, I'm sitting in a French-made cafe in Akiba Electricity Town, listening to a sad chanson that's playing sometime in your past, which is also my present, writing this and wondering about you, somewhere in my future. And if you're reading this, then maybe by now you're wondering about me too. You wonder about me. I wonder about you. Who are you, and what are you doing? Are you in a New York subway car hanging from a strap, or soaking in your hot tub in Sunnyvale? Are you sunbathing on a sandy beach in Phuket, or having your toenails buffed in Abu Dhabi? Are you a male or a female, or somewhere in between? Is your girlfriend cooking you a yummy dinner, or are you eating cold Chinese noodles from a box? Are you curled up with your back turned coldly towards your snoring wife, or are you eagerly waiting for your beautiful lover to finish his bath so you can make passionate love to him? Do you have a cat, and is she sitting on your lap? Does her forehead smell like cedar trees and fresh, sweet air? Actually, it doesn't matter very much, because by the time you read this, everything will be different, and you will be nowhere in particular, flipping idly through the pages of this book, which happens to be the diary of my last days on earth, wondering if you should keep on reading. And if you decide not to read anymore, hey, no problem, because you're not the one I was waiting for anyway. But if you do decide to read on, then guess what? You're my kind of time being, and together we'll make magic. So that's the voice that kind of came to me. And this was all very promising. And I was very excited. Novels very often come to me as voices. And as soon as I heard Nao's voice, I knew certain things about her right from the start. I knew that she was a junior high school student. She was sitting in a maid cafe in Tokyo. I have no idea why. She was writing in some kind of diary. I sensed that she was troubled, possibly even suicidal, but she had this attitude and a kind of quirky sense of humor, which seemed to point to an inner source of strength. I knew she was writing in English, which was odd, because why would a Japanese schoolgirl be writing in English? And it was clear that she was writing to someone, which was also odd, because normally we don't write diaries for others to read. But Nao definitely had a reader in mind. And she had all the confidence of a young writer, sort of casting her words out into the world, certain that someone would be there to receive them, and knowing that when that happened, something magical would occur. The problem was that Nao didn't know who her reader was, and so neither did I. So it was my job then, as a novelist, to figure this out. Who is Nao's reader? And this took a very long time. It took 5 years. 5 years is an extremely long time. I would even say that it's an achingly long time for a novelist whose last book had been published almost a decade earlier. But during that achingly long time, little by little, Nao's story emerged. It turned out that her father was a computer interface designer who had been headhunted by a gaming startup in Silicon Valley. So Nao grew up in Sunnyvale, California. When she was 14, her father lost his job through mysterious circumstances, and the family was forced to move back to Tokyo. Nao's father became a recluse, spending his days folding elaborate origami insects to stave off thoughts of suicide. Nao's mother is supporting the family, and Nao has been put into Japanese junior high school, where she's the target of bullying so terrible she feels she has no choice but to commit suicide. But before she ends her life, she's determined to do one last act of redemption, to tell the fascinating life story of her 104-year-old great-grandmother, old Jiko, who is a Zen Buddhist nun. Now, as you probably remember, old Jiko isn't just any 104-year-old Zen Buddhist nun. She's a 104-year-old anarchist feminist Zen Buddhist nun. Anarchist feminist novelist Zen Buddhist nun. Old Jiko is Nao's only friend and really the only reliable adult in her life. So Nao sets out to write down old Jiko's fascinating life story in the pages of her diary, but of course, being 16 years old, she finds her own life far more fascinating, and she keeps getting distracted. So this was all well and good. The problem was that I still couldn't figure out the identity of Nao's reader, and time was passing. In fact, I'd been obsessed about time long before I started writing this novel. My interest in time started back in 1998, the year my father died. There's nothing like the death of a parent or a loved one to make you wake up to the urgency of time passing. And two, I think we were all thinking about time back then because we were standing on the cusp of a new millennium, which seemed like such a significant event on one hand, and at the same time utterly arbitrary. On one hand, it felt very special to be alive to witness the turn of the millennium, because not many of us human time beings get to do this. Redwood trees are more likely to witness the turn of a millennium than we are, although, of course, they wouldn't know it. They're trees, they don't care. But for some reason, we do care, and because we're such short-lived time beings, the turn of the millennium felt pretty special. And we were all making a great big fuss about it. I mean, you must remember all of those apocalyptic millennial predictions about the end of the world flying around back then. Thankfully, they all proved false, at least we think they did. And then there was that whole Y2K scare. Do you remember that, the millennial bug? Which was going to cause all of the computers in the world to shut down, along with all the banks and the utilities and the governments, so that at the end of December 1999, people were all frantically stockpiling food and bottled waters and flashlights and batteries, waiting for the big event, and then nothing. Phew. And then a year later, it was 2001, an iconic year because of the Kubrick film, 2001: A Space Odyssey. It came out in 1968 when I was 12 years old, and I saw it in a theater. Remember that? Because back then we didn't have Netflix. How did we ever survive without streaming video? And that film represented a distant future so far away, it was unimaginable. 2001 seemed like the end of time, or it did to me when I was 12. And yet suddenly, there we were in 2001. And the months passed, and the world was still there. And then the sun rose one bright blue morning of September 11th. 9/11 wasn't the end of the world, but there were moments when it felt like it might be. I was in Wisconsin at the time. I'd gone there to give a talk at the university, and I remember watching those planes crashing into the twin towers of the World Trade Center and the towers falling, and then renting a car and driving all the way home across the continent to the island in British Columbia where I lived so that I could be with my mother, who was living there with us at the time. And since you've read A Tale for the Time Being, this story must sound familiar to you. And here is where another element of the novel fell into place. In the wake of 9/11, many of the television pundits were comparing the terrorist attack to the Japanese kamikaze bombings during World War II. And right around this time, a book called Kamikaze, Cherry Blossoms, and Nationalisms was published. I stumbled across it because the author, an anthropologist at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, had written an op-ed piece criticizing, and this was in the New York Times, criticizing the comparison between the 9/11 terrorists and the kamikaze pilots. And this got me interested. The book was an analysis of the letters and diaries of kamikaze pilots, beautiful, poetic, learned writing, which revealed that these pilots were not the fundamentalist, imperialist fanatics that history painted them to be. On the contrary, most of them were just college students, sensitive, bright, intellectual, poets and philosophers, Marxists and pacifists, who had been conscripted and trained to fly suicide missions in support of a war they opposed to defend a country they loved. Their writing detailed their agonizing struggle to make sense of their lives, what remained of them, in the face of certain death, and I found this tremendously poignant and moving. I grew up in the shadow of World War II, and these were stories I'd never heard before. These young men were time beings who had dropped out of time, leaving holes and gaps in the historical record. I felt haunted by their absence, and a character, Haruki, was born from this. From 2001 to 2006, I started 2 or 3 different novels about this young philosophy student pilot, and none of them worked, so I abandoned them, but I kept hoping that at some point I would find a way to tell his story. To tell you the truth, my writing wasn't going very well at this point. I was in a bit of a funk during those first years of the new millennium. I kept starting and discarding novels, and in desperation, I even tried writing a memoir. My mother had Alzheimer's, and I was taking care of her during the last years of her life. She was almost 90 by then, an ancient time being who was traveling backwards in time. Although she was very alive and present in each moment, she was losing her short-term memory, and she couldn't remember things that had happened a few days or weeks or months or even minutes earlier. Little by little, her recent memories were dissolving until only the old ones remained, memories of her childhood growing up in Hawaii, beautifully preserved like insects in amber. She was another time being, dropping out of time. And in my memoir, I wanted to write about this, about taking care of her, about her stories, about her fascinating life. So all of this was interesting and sad and frightening and frustrating. I'd had a casual meditation practice for some time, but towards the end of my mother's life, I started taking my Zen practice very seriously, and this is what led me to read Dogen's essay, Uji, the Time Being. So you can see how all of these random elements, the deaths of my parents, Y2K, 9/11, the kamikaze diaries, Zen, Dogen, all sort of came together in my mind. You might remember that in the novel I talked about the great garbage patches spinning around in the oceanic gyres. Well, that's how my mind feels most of the time. Like a mental gyre with all this enormous garbage patch spinning around inside it, made up of all the information and debris and detritus of my life. And from this great garbage patch of my mind, Now's voice emerged, calling out for someone to listen, to pick up her diary and to read it. Which brings us back to Now's unknown reader. As I mentioned earlier, I spent 5 years searching for this character. The process was a bit like casting an actor for a role in a film or a play, only in very slow motion. I'd think of a character and invite him into the fictional world. I'd arrange for him to find the diary, he'd read it, and then he'd start to react. Now would respond, and little by little, the fictional world would start to grow, getting all round and plump and promising. And then one moment, a few months or even a year later, I'd open the manuscript and find that the world had gone flat, like a burst balloon. And I'd realize then that I had the wrong reader, so I'd usher him out, and after a suitable period of grieving, I would think of another reader, maybe a woman this time, and invite her into the fictional world, and we'd start the whole business all over again. I repeated this process 4 or 5 times in as many years and wrote 4 or 5 completely different versions of the book, each with a different character cast in the role of the reader. Some of them were young, some of them were old, some of them were male, some of them were female, some were in between. And each time, with each reader, Now's story would get a little bit longer. Finally, at the beginning of 2011, I actually managed to finish a draft. It wasn't a very good draft. It was a completely different book than the one that you read. It had a different reader and a very different plot. In fact, it was set in a library. And it had all sorts of problems. I gave it to my agent, who agreed that it had all sorts of problems. And we were just about to submit it to my editor, hoping that she would help fix it, when on March 11th, the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami struck Japan. So next Friday is March 11th, the 5-year anniversary of the earthquake and the tsunami and the meltdown at Fukushima. And I'll never forget 5 years ago, sitting in front of my computer, just riveted to the screen, watching those horrifying images of the wave obliterating towns and villages along the coastline and washing them out to sea. I'm sure you won't forget those images either. I have friends and family in Tokyo and Sendai, and so my first concern was, of course, for their safety. But when the meltdown at Fukushima nuclear reactor occurred, my worry turned global. The world was a different place. Japan was a different place. And at some point, it hit me that the novel that I'd written was no longer relevant. Certain catastrophic events create a rift, dividing time into before and after. I had written a pre-earthquake, pre-tsunami, pre-Fukushima book. We were now living in a post-earthquake, post-tsunami, post-Fukushima world. So I knew I couldn't go forward with this book, and I asked my agent to return the manuscript, and I figured that was pretty much the end of it. But Now's voice just kept coming back to me and wouldn't leave me alone. I talked it over with my husband, Oliver, and he made a suggestion. He pointed out that the devastating reality of the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown had indeed broken the world, and it had certainly broken the fictional world of my novel. And since this was the case, the only appropriate response was to acknowledge this brokenness. And the way to do this was to step into the novel myself as a, quote, real person who would break the seamless illusion of a fictional world and allow it to stay broken. Now's reader had to be me, and the earthquake and tsunami and nuclear meltdown, these awful, catastrophic, random, but very real factors, had to become part of the story. I thought about this, and I realized that Oliver was right. He usually is. But then I pointed out that if I were going to be in the book, he would have to be in the book too. And thankfully, he agreed. He said he thought it would be an interesting thought experiment. You know Oliver. So finally, the time had come for a tale for the time being to be written. I unzipped the manuscript, like that, and threw about 2/3 of it away and started over again. In this final version, Now's diary washes up on the beach on the far side of the Pacific Ocean on a remote island off the coast of Canada, just a bit north of here, where it's discovered by a reader, the perfect reader, as it turns out, whose name is Ruth. And I'll just read you a little bit of this section so you can hear it the way I hear it. A tiny sparkle caught Ruth's eye. A small glint of refracted sunlight angling out from beneath a massive tangle of drying bullkelp, which the sea had heaved up onto the sand at full tide. She mistook it for the sheen of a dying jellyfish and almost walked right by it. The beaches were overrun with jellyfish these days, the monstrous, red, stinging kind that looked like wounds along the shoreline. But something made her stop. She leaned over and nudged the heap of kelp with the toe of her sneaker and then poked it with a stick. Untangling the whip-like fronds, she dislodged enough to see that what glistened underneath was not a dying sea jelly, but something plastic, a bag. Not surprising, the ocean was full of plastic. She dug a bit more until she could lift the bag up by its corner. It was heavier than she expected, a scarred plastic freezer bag encrusted with barnacles that spread across its surface like a rash. It must have been in the ocean for a long time, she thought. Inside the bag, she could see a hint of something red. Someone's garbage, no doubt, tossed overboard or left behind after a picnic or a rave. The sea was always heaving things up and hurling them back. Fishing lines, floats, beer cans, plastic toys, tampons, Nike sneakers. A few years earlier, it was severed feet. People were finding them up and down Vancouver Island, washed up on the sand. One had been found on this very beach. No one could explain what had happened to the rest of the bodies. Ruth didn't want to think about what might be rotting inside the bag. She flung it farther up the beach. She would finish her walk and then pick it up on the way back, take it home, and throw it out. Well, needless to say, as you know, she didn't throw it out. Instead, she takes it home and leaves it on the porch where her husband Oliver finds it. He had smoothed the bags flat, laid them out on top of one another in descending order of size, and then sorted the contents into 3 neat collections: a small stack of handwritten letters, a pudgy bound book with a faded red cover, a sturdy antique wristwatch with a matte black face and a luminous dial. Next to these sat the Hello Kitty lunchbox that had protected the contents from the corrosive effects of the sea. The cat was sniffing at the lunchbox. Ruth picked him up and dropped him on the floor and then turned her attention to the items on the table. The letters appeared to be written in Japanese. The cover of the red book was printed in French. The watch had markings etched onto the back that were difficult to decipher, so Oliver had taken out his iPhone and was using the microscope app to examine the engraving. "I think this is Japanese too," he said. Ruth flipped through the letters, trying to make out the characters that were written in faded blue ink. "The handwriting's old and cursive, beautiful, but I can't read a word of it." She put the letters down and took the watch from him. "Yes," she said, "they're Japanese numbers. Not a date, though. 47387. Maybe a serial number?" She held the watch up to her ear and listened for the ticking, but it was broken. She put it down and picked up the bright red lunchbox. The red color showing through the scarred plastic was what had led her to mistake the freezer bag for a stinging jellyfish. How long had it been floating out there on the ocean before washing up? The lunchbox lid had a rubber gasket around the rim. She picked up the book, which was surprisingly dry, the cloth cover soft and worn, its corners blunt from rough handling. She put the edge to her nose and inhaled the musty scent of mildewed pages and dust. She looked at the tarnished gilt title embossed on the red cloth spine. "À la recherche du temps perdu," she read, by Marcel Proust. Her French wasn't great, but she opened the cover anyway, curious to see if she could understand just the first few lines. She was expecting to see an age-stained folio printed in an antique font, so she was entirely unprepared for the adolescent purple handwriting that sprawled across the page. It felt like a desecration, and it shocked her so much she almost dropped the book. "Hi," she read. "My name is Now, and I'm a time being. Do you know what a time being is?" It's okay. Thank you. Thank you. It's fun reading out loud. So this whole process up until this point took about 5 years, 5.5 years, and the last, after I unzipped it and threw 2/3 away and sat down to reconstruct it again, that process took about 5 months. It happened very, very, very fast. And I think this illustrates an important point, that novels are time beings too. They simply take the time they take. So I started tonight playing with this idea of being. About the fluid and dynamic and emerging and ever-changing story we call the self. And that's the being part of time being. And then I talked a little bit about time as it related to the writing of this novel. And now I'd like to shift gears and talk a little bit more about time, but in a more general sense. The years I spent studying and sitting with Dogen's teaching on time got me thinking about the way we understand or misunderstand time in our contemporary culture. I think it's safe to say that most of us feel like we live pretty busy lives, right? Is that right? Yeah. I mean, we never seem to have enough time to answer all of our email or get all of our things done, get all of the things done on our to-do lists. We're always behind. And I may be wrong about this. I mean, some of you might feel that you have too much time on your hands. No? I mean, maybe, I hope not, but maybe you do. Either way, I think we somehow feel that we're out of step with time or in a contentious relationship with time. And I think this comes from our limited understanding of time, which in itself is a function of both who we are and the times we live in. So this sounds a little bit more confusing than it is, so bear with me. We are materialists, living in a post-Enlightenment, rationalist, empiricist, secular, scientific, technological consumer culture. These values and beliefs together form the lens through which we see the world and which determines how we experience our lives. So when we look at time through this rationalist, materialist, et cetera, lens, we naturally experience it as something material too. Time becomes quantifiable and a limited commodity, a finite resource, something we consume, and our language reflects this. Keeping time, wasting time, spending time, running out of time, killing time, saving time, taking, gaining, losing time, etc. This materialist view of time as a limited commodity seems to be an outgrowth of our Judeo-Christian view of time as linear, beginning with God's creation and ending with the end of the world. But of course, linear time is only one way of understanding time, and it seems important to remember that there are many other ways of understanding and experiencing time too. As I'm sure you know, many ancient cultures, Mayan and Native American, Greek, Hindu, Buddhist, understood time as cyclical, these great temporal gyres like the cycles of the seasons that are endlessly replenishing and renewing. The ancient Greeks had two different words for time, chronos and kairos. Chronos referred to quantifiable chronological time. Kairos refers to a qualitative or metaphysical time, literally the right or supreme or opportune moment in which something or anything can happen. This is more akin to our notion of timeliness. Dogen Zenji had a wonderfully all-inclusive view of time as being, as existence itself, which was not dissimilar to what Martin Heidegger described 700 years later in his work, Being and Time. The way we view or map time determines the way we experience it, but in the end, these maps and lenses are also only stories, metaphorical, arbitrary, and even imaginary. All that exists, all that we can really know, is the present moment. The past doesn't exist. If it exists, where is it? And the same holds true for the future. Where is it? It's nowhere. It exists only in our minds. Our minds are time travelers, continually spinning off into some imaginary past or future, while our bodies are fixed in a particular moment in time and space. So our bodies and minds are often at odds with each other. We do one thing with our bodies, but in our minds we are someplace else entirely, telling ourselves stories about the past or future, worrying about an upcoming deadline or an email we sent or an argument we had with a spouse or a friend or what we want to eat for dinner. Our bodies and minds are rarely together in the present moment at the same time, and this skews the alignment between being and time and causes all sorts of suffering, which is what makes us humans such anxious and unsettled time beings. Unlike cats. Once again, I suspect this is an experience that most cats do not have, at least not to the extent that we do, but of course I may be completely wrong about this too. Anyway, let me give you an example of the way our mapping of time determines the way we experience it. Because we're a progress-driven culture, we think of the past as existing somewhere behind us, and therefore we're making progress into the future, which lies ahead, right? But not everyone uses the same mental map. The Aymara tribe of Peru, and I think this was true for ancient China as well, view the past as being in front of us. Okay? So the past is in front of you. And why is that? Well, it's because you can see it, right? You know it. You know what happened in the past. It's right here, right? You know your dead ancestors who have gone before you, and they are always with you, leading the way. But the future is unknown, so it's back there, behind us, someplace that we can't yet see. You know, it's like, oh, what's that? Right? It's my future creeping up behind me. So our future is always sort of trailing after us. So our experience of time is only one of many. Our post-Enlightenment, rationalist, materialist lens, etc., renders time as a quantifiable, linear commodity, and that's how we experience it. The clock is ticking, like sands through the hourglass. These are the days of our lives. I used to be a filmmaker, and this metaphor of a lens is one that works for me, and I think any photographer will relate to this too. Lenses are interesting because they distort our perception of space the way that clocks distort our perception of time. If you look at the world through a telephoto lens, for example, the lens shortens the distance between you and the object you're looking at, and it narrows your visual field and makes everything look taller and slimmer. A wide-angle lens, on the other hand, expands your visual field and makes things look far away, but wider. A fisheye lens gives you the widest visual field, but it makes objects round and straight lines appear curved. So if you're born with a fisheye lens attached to your face, and you've only ever viewed the world through that lens, you might imagine that the world is spherical and people are round and short. You would have no way of knowing anything else because lenses are clear and transparent, and you can't see them. You can only see their effects. This is, I think, analogous to what's happened to our perception of time. Our watches and timers and clocks and calendars and schedules, our time management systems and our obsession with efficiency and speed have distorted our experience of time and being. But since this lens is largely invisible, we mistake what we see as reality. Here's another example of the way perception changes our experience of time. This one is a kind of thought experiment proposed by our friend Dogen back in 1250. It's funny, I think of, Dogen is the founder of the Soto Zen lineage, which is my lineage, and I think of him as kind of a pre-modern, postmodernist, if such a thing is possible, because of the way he deconstructs time and narrative and our notions of being. The purpose of Dogen's thought experiment is to exhort us, and actually he's exhorting his young monks, but we can pretend that it's us, exhorting us to stay committed to a path of practice and awakening. And in his instruction, he performs a kind of rhetorical sleight of hand to illustrate the relationship between time and action. He takes time and radically expands it by telling us that a single day is actually comprised of 6,400,099,980 moments. I don't know where he got that number, but it's very precise. So the time it takes to snap your finger represents 65 moments. Right? And that's a lot of moments. And then he tells us that every single one of those moments is a precious opportunity to reestablish our will and choose an action that will be beneficial to our karma. The snap of a finger gives us 65 opportunities to wake up. Okay? And again, as a filmmaker, I just think this is interesting because it's like a slow motion special effect. When you're shooting film and you want to slow down an action, you actually have to increase the frame rate. In other words, the number of frames moving through the camera so that more frames pass across the shutter at a faster speed. And then, when that film is projected back at normal speed, the image appears to be moving in slow motion. That's pretty much what Dogen is doing here. He's performing a kind of conceptual slow motion special effect on our experience of time passing 650 years before motion picture technology was invented. Like, how cool is that? So I find this view of time to be quite astonishing. It's incredibly expansive and generous. It means that there's always enough time if you just slow down. If you slow down and take your time, you will have plenty of opportunities to choose to do something beneficial, to take a walk, to help someone out of a jam, or to be kind instead of impatient, right? So my point here is just that there are many ways of experiencing time, and our way may not be the best or the healthiest for us time beings. I often feel like we've fallen out of sync with time. We've forgotten how to experience time as being, and as a result, we're suffering from a kind of temporal dysfunction, a distemporality, which results from our misperception of time as a quantifiable commodity. From time to time, our lens slips or loses focus, and we get a sense that something is amiss. We feel exhausted, we feel overwhelmed, and we feel, too, a sense that there must be something more to life. But most of the time, we just go along with the program. But in fact, we do have ways of stepping out of that rat race and into different time streams. We have ways of shifting from chronos to kairos, from quantitative to qualitative time. Literature, art, music, philosophy, religion, ritual, all provide more expansive, embodied ways of being in time. When you read a great book, or look at a painting, or listen to a symphony, or take part in a communion ritual, you're participating in time in a different way. And needless to say, the same holds true if you make art, or write poems, or play music. Deep concentration and meditation are similar. In fact, when you meditate, being in time is all you're doing. Which brings us back to A Tale for the Time Being and your superpower. So, hang on just a second, let me just check. Good, okay. Just checking. So, old Jiko, our 104-year-old anarchist, feminist, Zen Buddhist nun, knows that her great-granddaughter is being bullied in school, and she decides that now needs some way of coping with her feelings of sadness and anger and fear. She needs some power, some true power, like a superpower. But of course, old Jiko doesn't speak English very well, so she pronounces it more like superpower. Actually, it's more like superpower. And what she's talking about is the power of meditation. And this is what she teaches now, how to sit zazen. So, what is zazen and why is it a superpower? Well, Zen Master Dogen called zazen the backward step. He instructed his students to learn to take the backward step that turns the light and shines it inward. So that's what we do. We straighten our bodies, we quiet our minds, and we take the backward step out of the relentless, forward-moving, progress-driven striving of everyday life. We turn the light of our awareness to our breathing, to our being, in time. And basically, that's it. The point isn't to achieve some kind of blissed-out transcendental state. I mean, that might happen, and it's not a problem if it does, but it's really much more ordinary than that. We're simply training ourselves to be fully present in time, not adding anything, not evaluating, not judging, just simply being in the present moment, now. As old Jiko says, to do zazen is to enter time completely. Of course, often when we meditate, we get sucked back into the past events, past memories, regrets. I should have said this, I should have done that. Or we project into the future, all of our plans and worries and anxieties. I need to do this, buy that, remember this. And so we fall out of time. But when that happens, it's not a problem either. Minds are meant to think, and when they do, it's simply an opportunity to notice and to come back without beating yourself up too much. In fact, when we often talk about meditation as a practice of return. You notice your mind spinning off, and instead of judging yourself, you just come back again and again and again to your breath, to yourself, and to your being. And the reason old Jiko calls this a superpower is because when you practice like this, over time, you develop a powerful capacity for patience, which is an undervalued, not a very sexy virtue in our hyperactive consumer culture. but yet one that's critically important, not just for achingly slow writers like me, but also for the future of the planet and for everyone on it. You also develop the powerful ability to listen and to pay attention to those quiet little voices that are alive inside all of us, whispering and rustling and shuffling around. And if you learn to listen and really pay attention, you'll catch what they say. If you're not listening, if you're checking your email or binge-watching Game of Thrones, that would be me, the voices will just give up and go away. They don't really care one way or the other. And finally, you develop a powerful kind of faith and confidence, knowing that you can sit quietly with your mind and your feelings, even the harsh and difficult ones, without resisting or being too derailed by them. So when the time comes, you can respond to others and the world with a little bit more clarity and kindness and compassion. So faith, patience, the ability to listen to your intuition and pay attention, these are some of the rewards of old Jiko's superpower. And what I propose now is that we end by practicing our superpower together. What do you say? You up for this? Okay, good. I know this is Bellingham, and probably everybody here meditates, and you're all totally enlightened already. But still, it's a rare opportunity to really sit in silence with 700, 800 people. So let's just take a moment and do this and enjoy each other's company. So here's what we'll do. First, let me just say that it'll get very quiet in here without me yammering on. And so if suddenly you feel you need to cough or sneeze or sniffle, don't worry. Just go right ahead and do that, right? Your neighbors will forgive you, right? We've all coughed and sneezed and sniffled before, right? Has anybody never coughed? Okay, so there. So just don't worry about this, okay? And so what I'd like to ask you to do is to, first of all, if you're holding anything in your lap, just put it down on the ground or tuck it behind you. Good. And then I'd like to ask you to just kind of sit up. I don't know, I've not sat in these seats, so I don't know how comfortable they are, but just see if you can just kind of, bring yourself into a kind of upright posture. You can plant your feet firmly on the ground in front of you. And then you can take your palms and place them on your knees. Kind of just find a nice, stable position like that. And then once you've found a little bit of a stable position, why don't you go ahead, you can close your eyes. We'll all close our eyes. And just take a moment to, to feel what it feels like to be sitting there. And then just take a couple of nice, deep, slow breaths. Breathe at your own pace. Just a couple of deep breaths, letting them out. And then bring your awareness to the top of your head. We'll do a brief body scan. Just noticing any sensations on your scalp, on the top of your head. And then allowing your awareness to drop down into your forehead, your temples, your jaw, your mouth. If you'd like, you can open your mouth and close it just to loosen up the muscles there. And just relax, just letting all of the tension go. And then allowing your awareness to sort of drop down the back of your head into your neck, your throat, down into your shoulders. We hold a lot of tension in our shoulders, so just once again, just allow that awareness to help your shoulders relax. And moving down again into the arms, elbows, your forearms, and your hands. Taking a moment to feel the sensation of your palms pressing against your knees. Notice any little variations in temperature there, any small little sensation. And then bringing your awareness back up into your chest, into your rib cage. And here it's nice to take a couple of deep breaths again. And as you breathe, notice the sensation of perhaps the cloth of your clothing brushing against your skin as your ribs expand and contract. Just noticing those little sensations there. And then allowing your awareness to drop down into your belly. And here, just take a moment to really relax. Just relax the muscles of your stomach. We rarely do this, so it feels nice just to let those muscles go. And then dropping down again, just allowing your awareness to move down into your pelvis, into the bones that support you. Feel the pressure of the seat underneath you, supporting you. Allowing your awareness to drop down more, again, into your thighs and knees. Noticing the pressure of your palms, perhaps, pressing against your knees. And down into your shins, your calves, your ankles, your feet, right down into the soles of your feet. Just noticing the feeling of the ground beneath you, once again, just supporting you. And then just allowing that awareness to sort of move back up and fill your body again. Just checking in to any of the spots where perhaps you were holding tension before, touching them with your awareness, using your awareness to help you relax. And then very gently bringing your awareness to your breath. Just following your breath in and out again. Just a very light attention resting on the breath. The breath gives you something to return to, so that if thoughts come and you find yourself moving away, moving out of the present moment, then just notice that this is happening. It's not a big deal. Minds are meant to think, so just notice that you've been pulled away from your breath and just return. And we'll just sit like this for another minute or so. And then, as you're finishing, your meditation. You can just very gently, with your eyes closed, bring a little bit of movement back into your body. If you'd like, you can rock gently from side to side or forward and back. Shrug your shoulders, move your head around. Sometimes it feels nice to rub your face. Take a deep breath, and when you're ready, open your eyes. Hello. Wow, you're all still here. I had my eyes closed, you know. I always wondering if I open my eyes and I'm standing here all by myself, you know. Wouldn't that be funny? So how many of you found that easy? Raise your hand. Okay. I told you, right? It's Bellingham, right? How many of you found it difficult? Raise your hand. Kind of a little awkward, uncomfortable. Okay, good. How many of you felt that you were doing it right? Raise your hand. And how many of you felt you were doing it wrong? Did anybody feel sleepy? Anybody feel kind of sleepy? Oh, yeah. Okay, good. And did anybody feel like, kind of jumpy, like your mind was chattering away, jumping around? Yeah, okay, good. And did you feel that time was passing slowly? Okay. And anybody feel that time was passing really fast? Okay, good. Well, this is perfect. This is all exactly right. Okay. The good news is that there's really no way of getting this wrong. Okay. Whatever you experience today is exactly your experience, right? It's exactly your meditation today, and it's just exactly what it's supposed to be. So I told you, you're all experts at this. So anyway, I think on that note, it's probably time to wrap it up here. Yeah, good. Thank you for spending a few of your very precious moments with me. And I think we still have time for questions, so why don't, yeah, good. Our wonderful MC is here, so
All right.
Thank you very much.
Now we do have time for questions. You'll see that there are some microphones set up in the aisles if you'd like to make your way out to the mics and stand in line. Since I have the microphone up here, I actually get to ask the first question. So, and I have a little bit of insider knowledge from a brief chat that Ruth and I had backstage. So I'm going to start off with a question about, Ruth, can you share with us some of the differences between the Ruth who's here tonight, this time being, and the Ruth that we read about in A Tale for the Time Being?
Well, I'm a lot smarter than her. Yeah. She gave up her apartment in New York. I didn't. Yeah. No, it's interesting because it's very interesting because for some reason, because of the nature of language, obviously this is a novel, so this is a fictionalized version, right? But we think of language as being able to tell the truth, right? And so it's a confusion. It confuses us. If I were an artist and I painted a self-portrait, right, and there was a self-portrait here and I'm here, you would never confuse the self-portrait with me, the person, right? You know that this is a representation and you know that this is a live human being, right? But for some reason, with language, it becomes a little bit more complicated. And so there's this sense that language is a tool that we use to tell the truth, whereas any description of anything is just a representation of it, right? And so it's a limited version. And so in this case, certainly, the Ruth in the book is a she's similar to me in many ways, but in many ways she's also very different. I mean, I didn't actually find a Hello Kitty lunchbox on the beach. You know that, right? Yeah. Okay. However, the voice of this girl did wash up on the shores of my imagination. So in that sense, there was a metaphorical truth to it. So, so that's it.
I just wanted you to hear about the New York apartment.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question here.
Hi.
Thank you so much, Ruth. That was delightful and took me right out of time to
Good.
experience that.
Or put you right in it,
I suppose it did. I wanted to ask you, you had so many iterations of that book, and it sounds like you had so many other stories going on at the same time. Do you have a world of novels that you're living in besides these that we've seen?
Well, put it this way, there are lots of ideas for novels. I'm never short of ideas. What I am short of is time. Ironic as that may seem. I'm working on another novel now. And unfortunately, as I said, I am an achingly slow writer, and this is a problem for me. But it's one that I try to have patience with. I think probably because I am a slow writer, I have to put a lot of ideas into one book. Right, I have to sort of cram a lot of ideas into one book because I just simply won't have time to write more. So. But yes, I mean, I always am. I'm always writing something, and I always have a sense of what might come after. I think I've got about 3 or 4 lined up, and I just hope I can live long enough to write them all. So, yeah, it's a race.
Thank you. So, is the writer present all the time, or just the author while you're doing these kinds of things?
I think that what I've discovered is that if you can. If the writer can keep the idea alive, and I use a process journal, and a process journal is a wonderful way of doing this, right? I keep a process journal, and I'm constantly writing notes and ideas and stuff like that down in the journal. And so as long as you can keep it alive, then part of your unconscious is always working on the idea a little bit, right? And so, the worst thing is to stop, is to let the idea, is to get too far away from it. Because I think that, Annie Dillard wrote this amazing, have you read a book called A Writing Life? I think it's called, right? A Writing Life, yeah. She describes neglected manuscripts or neglected, work in progress as becoming feral. Right. And it's true. If you leave them alone, they become feral. They go wild on you, and they're very, very dangerous at that point. They can bite you, and they can really do a lot of damage. So the idea is to, stay in constant touch with them and keep them domesticated, right? So, yeah.
In the preface to the book Choices that you wrote for Whatcom Reads, you have a lot of interesting prompts for writers, like throw a feather and throw it as far as you can, and writing poems from cutout newspapers. Yeah. But there are a couple that really bother me, and one is...
Good, they're supposed to.
Social project number 4, find a way to end global warming, make it work. Another is social project number 5, find a way to end poverty, make it work. Yeah. So I want to know, if you had to follow that prompt, what would you say or write?
Well, either of those prompts, I assume you're talking about. I don't have an answer to that. My feeling is that we keep these problems. We keep these problems in our mind, and we try not to forget that we're living in a world that's beset with problems. We try not to turn away. We try to, we just try to keep our attention focused on that, as well as everything else in our lives, and we do our best, right? And it's never going to be good enough, Right, it's never going to be good enough. No one of us is ever going to be able to end world hunger or stop global warming or anything like that, obviously, right? But that doesn't mean, just because it's impossible doesn't mean that you can't try as hard as you can, right? And so that's really what that is. That's what it's about.
I feel better now, thank you.
Okay, good. Just keep trying. Just keep trying. Don't get discouraged.
Hi, with all your thinking about time, I wonder if you've read what Einstein has said about time and some of what his approach to it and thought problems and that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, I have, but as an amateur, I did a lot of reading as I was, when I was writing this book, I was reading a lot about time, and I was also reading a lot about quantum physics and these are not areas of expertise. This is it's material that information that I'm aware of. But I don't claim to know it in any kind of great detail. On the other hand, I really felt it was important to, if I was going to be using this stuff, to try to understand it enough so that it wasn't just a kind of pretty metaphor sitting on top. I read Einstein a lot less than I read, it was really it was quantum physics that was, and trying to understand Schrodinger's cat and trying to understand, quantum. The many worlds interpretation, things like that were important to me. So to answer your question, no, I didn't read that much Einstein, but just am very aware that he was certainly, he in a way defined time as we know it today, right? So yes.
Yeah. Hi. I really enjoyed your book. Thank you. I was captivated by the place in the book where Ruth steps into Now's story and that double trick of time and tale. And I'm really curious what your process was like to get to that. Was it an idea you had because you thought it'd be neat? Was it a requirement because of something you wanted to have happen in the book? So what led up to that, and how did that happen?
I'm trying to remember. I think I always had it in my mind that that Ruth, or that the reader, would somehow find a way of going back in time to and to alter events. This is a kind of trope in science fiction, in speculative fiction. But I was looking at it very much from a sort of Buddhist point of view, and I was thinking about Dogen in particular and about Uji, and I was trying to sort of perform, in a narrative way, in a sort of fictional way, trying to perform this sort of time flowing backwards, right? And I'm not sure whether I succeeded, but it was it was really a sort of, I was trying to sort of perform the way that the kind of fluidity of and nonlinearity of Dogen's view of time. And so that was, I think, probably what put the idea into my mind, was how do you show that? How do you enact that? And this certainly seemed to be a way to do it. But it also made, just as a writer, the relationship between a writer and between the writer and the reader and the text is a relationship that exists over time, right? And so in a way, readers are always acting on text, right? Readers are always reading and rereading and changing the text, right? So that, and this goes back to the many worlds, interpretation of quantum physics. The idea that, that there is one text that is fixed in time, of course, is not true. It's false, right? There are as many texts as there are readers who read it, right? And so there are, this is a kind of a example of, an array it's not just one book, it's an array of books, right? And it's an array of books that moves backwards and forwards in time as well. So those were the kinds of thoughts that were in my mind when I was devising that. It also is it's a time-honored plot trick, so.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Hi.
Hi. I was interested and somewhat troubled by the extreme cruelty of the Japanese middle schoolers in the story. And I was wondering how you researched or came with that story.
Yeah, sure. I'd been tracking bullying stories in the Japanese media probably since the 1990s. And in particular, instances related to, what was then an increasing number of cyberbullying. And that was more in the 2000s. But in any case, this was, the stories about bullying and in particular sort of teen suicide as related to bullying, right? These are stories that are in the Japanese media you read them all the time. It's part of, it's really, these incidents are happening and they're reported on, and it's seen as a problem, as a serious social problem. People talk about it. Institutions are involved in trying to eradicate this as a problem. And so there's a lot of awareness about this, right? And one of the things that I'd noticed over the years, I've been going back and forth between Japan for decades now, and I'd noticed that things that, that in a way Japan is a little bit like a canary in a coal mine. Things that happen, phenomena that arise in Japan, we'll start to see that in North America, 5-10 years later. I mean, the first time I noticed this, it sounds so silly, but the first time I noticed this was with Hello Kitty. Right, and Hello Kitty was wildly popular in Japan, and I thought at the time, this is never going to wash in America, right? And then 5 or 10 years later, it's everywhere, right? It's ubiquitous. And so, I mean, when I started to really look at these stories and notice that they were, popping up in media and in films. There's, a lot of movies and television shows, and it's almost a cliche in Japan. I just made me wonder: is this something that we're going to be contending with at some point in the West? And it certainly is. I just don't think that our media outlets are reporting on it as much as probably they, as I think they should be. There have been several rashes of bullying-related suicides on college campuses and high schools, and it's if you Google this, you'll see lots and lots of stories like this, but it's still the focus hasn't sort of moved onto it in the same concentrated sort of way. So in particular the kinds of things that that happened in the book, that now suffered in the book, these were all taken from accounts that I'd read over the years. And so really none of those details, I mean, the details were made up, obviously. Sure. They were fictionalized, but the incidents themselves were taken from real life events that I'd read about.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we have time for 2 more questions, just to alert the crowd.
Oh, good, and there's 2 more people.
All right,
yeah,
perfect.
Good.
Aloha, Ruth.
Aloha.
I am from Hawaii, and when I found out your mother is as well, I suddenly
That's
understood
right.
better.
What's that?
I understood better the connection I feel with you. You're brilliant.
Yeah, nice.
It's daunting to try to speak to you because you're so smart.
Oh,
But well,
it's a fiction.
You know what I mean. We all know what I mean. But I want to just bring up a subject that perplexes me about Buddhism, and it is emptiness.
Oh.
And I think your book is about emptiness, but it's not once mentioned. Am I close?
Ooh. Yes.
Hi, Ruth. Thank you so much for being here. I just wanted to say that, yes, My Year of Meats. We read it for our book group in the 90s, and I have to tell you, I mean, we're still laughing about it to this day, and I quote it constantly. And so I'm wondering, I mean, really, when I think of that book, I can think of the whole story. And a lot of books I did for book group, of course, I can't remember. But your book really stayed with me, that one.
Good.
And I made my kids read it. And I'm wondering whether or not you're a vegetarian.
I'm not a strict anything.
No.
Yeah, I'm not a strict anything.
No, but you really brought up some good points.
Yeah.
That need
I
to
try to
looked
be
at.
careful. You know, I try, for me, it's a balance of awareness, you know, versus consumption. And so I do try to be careful about what I eat. I try to make wise choices as much as I can. But I don't hold hard and fast to any particular dietary, you know.
Sounds like you could come and eat at my house. Okay.
Yeah. But, you know, one of the things that you know, it's been very interesting. That book was written, I wrote that book 18 years ago.
Yes.
And, you know, I recently went to Stanford because it was used as a first-year read at Stanford, right? This was just recently, like last year. And I realized that book was written in the same year, was published in the same year that these kids were born, right?
Right, yeah.
And so that was really, you know, that was incredibly encouraging to me as a writer, that my backlist book is still widely circulated and is being read by 18-year-olds. As a citizen, on the other hand, I found it very disturbing because, you know, I did some research just prior to going down to Stanford because I thought I really should beef up on the issue, you know. And, you know, and the you know, the problems with factory farming have not changed, you know. But what has changed is that those 18-year-olds were very aware. They were very aware of the problems, whereas 18 years ago, people were not aware of the problems, you know. So things have changed. You know, it takes longer for, you know, for agribusiness to, you know, to turn, but the, you know, consumers certainly are more aware now than they were before. So that's a heartening thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, good.
All right, that is all the time we have for questions.
Thank you.
Big thank you to Ruth.
Great, thanks.